Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. Now today we are speaking to Professor Hugo Frey. Hi Hugo, how are you doing?
Hi Jackson, thanks for asking me. Very pleased to be here.
I'm really looking forward
Good
to
evening.
well, good evening back to you as well. I'm really looking forward to chatting about the political historical imagination of Jacques Tardi today. And I'm really looking forward to chatting to you about it. You've taught me a lot about this in the past, especially from some of your lectures from online. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Cool, no, well done, and congrats on all your success as well. I'm always happy. We were just talking about how unusual it is to talk about comic books without showing the pictures, but actually, it feels fairly normal now we're doing it. So hopefully, anybody out there who's interested in history and its depiction in comics will be interested in this guy Jacques Tardi, because he's basically the leading figure for drawing comic books in France that are about the First World War and Second World War. And I know Jackson's watched me do an online lecture on this as well, and so hopefully you can see the lecture somewhere out there at some point. And then meanwhile, I'll try and make you all interested in Jacques Tardi.
Well, I'll make sure that lecture's in the description of the video for anyone who wants to go away and watch that. It is a really, really informative and really enjoyable lecture to watch. I certainly got a lot from it. So Hugo, where does your interest in French comic books and Jacques Tardi come from?
Okay, so the long-term interest is I'm a specialist historian in modern France originally, and that's what I'm trained in, and not comic strips at all, but to do with how the French remembered the Second World War. And as many of you know, France was occupied. There was effectively civil war conditions between collaborators supporting Hitler and various forms of resistance. And, I'm sure all your listeners know it ends with the Allied victory and liberation. And so my PhD was looking at how the French remembered that very traumatic history of effectively a civil war in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And in fact, all of my research, in a way, has looked at how France responds to the Second World War. And so I came to it really because nobody else was writing about how comic strips were depicting the Second World War in France in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so I had a kind of professional interest, a sociology of memory in France. And Jacques Tardi writes the main history, fictional history, semi-fictional, semi-real histories of France. And in France, he's like a superstar. So he's not so well known in the UK, but in French museums, French bookshops, his works are kind of globally known, particularly for looking at the First World War. But he also has some work that links to the Second World War and his father's experiences of that. So that's why, really. He kind of came in my range. I'm also I like reading comics.
So we're talking
and
to a world,
I like doing things that are different and that I enjoy doing.
So we're talking to a world leader in the French war narrative through you. Really, I'm really excited to.
Hopefully, yeah. Tardi basically, your viewers will have heard of Asterix, I guess. And you have the Asterix comics about the little Gaul and the funny fighting against the Romans. And then your viewers will have heard of Tintin, and you have the kind of Tintin action comedy adventure stories that come from Belgium. And I'm a historian who never pays too much attention to dates, but roughly in the 1970s, Tardi comes along into that world of publishing European comics, and he develops a career telling history stories, and primarily around the First World War. And he does it through two formats. He does it through a kind of sci-fi fantasy format, which are the adventures of Adèle Blanc-Sec. that are really good fun, and she's a kind of, she's compared to a kind of Indiana Jones type adventurer character, but underneath all of the kind of surrealism and horror and humor, for all the monsters she fights, the real monster is the First World War that's looming in the background, and of course killing so many ordinary French soldiers and Europeans. And then later in his career, he develops a series of really pacifist stories of the trenches. So this one's being translated into English. It was the War of the Trenches, and it's a series of. I was teaching on it and preparing the lecture that you've watched, and it's really a series of harrowing depictions of the suffering of ordinary people during the First World War, and it comes in France and Belgium. He's so famous, it's basically the dominant visual representation of the First World War. So British people will maybe know Blackadder Goes Forth, and some other maybe some other comics to do with the First World War too. But in France, Tardi and the story of the misery of the First World War from a pacifist perspective, he's famous. And the stories are brutal. The imagery of the drawings are all in black and white, and he uses long panel images to capture that kind of perspective of the trenches. And it's very powerful and very moving and upsetting stuff. And I guess you wouldn't, some of your listeners will be very fans of comics and know that comics can do very serious stories. So there's a famous Holocaust story, Mouse, by Art Spiegelman from America. And people who've heard of that will understand how Tardi can do something similar with the First World War. But those of your viewers who are more traditional history people, they should turn their attentions to graphic novels and comics. And Tardi does this, remarkable treatment of the First World War.
And you've also mentioned that Tardi also works in the World War II era as well. And
Yeah.
if we're zooming in on France in World War II, what's happening to France in World War II? It's emerged from World War One, and it's been plunged into another conflict. So what's happening to France in World War II?
Complicated question to answer quickly, but let me try and answer. So, I mean, basically, Britain and France in the interwar period have maintained democracies, and the Second World War breaks out 1939, and we have this period of uncertainty, in English sometimes called the Phony War. And then basically what follows is the military catastrophe of 1940. So for the British, we have Dunkirk and the retreat, and eventually some kind of attempt to recover through the air war, through the Battle of Britain. Now for the French on mainland Europe, the summer of 1940 is known as the catastrophe. All of democratic Western Europe is occupied. And in June 1940, effectively, France slowly enters into a period of high political instability. And basically, two sides emerge. You have the side associated with a military leader called Pétain, who signs an armistice with the German occupiers and instigates effectively a far-right reactionary government, which is called the Vichy regime, named after the town where he situates his headquarters at a spa town called Vichy that's near Lyon. And then you have your other response by the figure that your viewers will have heard of, General de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle Airport, named after him in Paris years later. De Gaulle is a junior officer. He's fought in the catastrophe battle. He does not want to surrender, and he rapidly takes a flight to London. And on the 18th of June 1940, he broadcasts a message of resistance saying, you know, we've lost the battle, but we haven't lost the war. Resistance must continue. I'm in London. And everything that follows, in a way, is divided between those two tendencies. Now, of course, in the middle, there's a lot of grey areas and nuances, and ordinary people have to come to adjustments. But in the high level political history, you have the choice of resistance and the choice of collaboration. And effectively, as the war develops and as the Allies gain strength, de Gaulle's star rises, leading eventually to the victory of the resistance in 44-45, following D-Day landings, etc. And the story of collaboration declines and effectively loses. And however, in the 4-year period of occupation, the collaborating regime seeks to build a kind of empire of its own within Nazi-occupied Europe. And in part of that, Pétain and his ministers instigate their own anti-Semitic legislation without Nazi request, and by the middle of the war become imbricated in full policies of genocide. And so the occupation is a terrible period of political schism, but also under the auspices of Vichy is a period of political shame in its complicity with the Holocaust. And so the end of the war, we see the collaborators defeated, we see de Gaulle returned, but France has been through this terrible trauma, occupation, Holocaust policies on its territory, civil war between resistors and collaborators. And we're very lucky, Jackson, to be too young to have ever experienced anything like this. But equally, Britain has not been occupied. And so we've got this awful experience of occupation. And it's only through military victory at the end that leads to the end of the occupation. And of course, ordinary people in France know who has collaborated, who has resisted. The resistance become heroes after the war, but the coming to terms and conclusion of what an occupation means leads to these after effects in the post-war period that really in some ways continue to the present day.
Well, I was going to follow on from that. I was going to follow on and ask how did and how does France wrestle with that legacy, and how does that affect Tardi?
Exactly. Great question. So basically, a famous historian called Henri Rousseau writes a book called The Vichy Syndrome that is his take on how France deals with that legacy. And he basically says that for a long time after the war, they celebrate the resistance and, very generally speaking, to paraphrase, sweep under the carpet the crimes of Vichy. But then as there's generational change through the late 60s, early 70s, there is suddenly an awareness, my God, what did what did the older generation do? What did collaboration mean? And, how had France become complicit in the Holocaust? And so I suppose since the late 60s, early 70s onwards, there's then been an obsession with confronting the shame of collaboration. And I suppose, this is kind of broadly my lifetime. Over that 50-year period, France has wrestled with addressing the shame of collaboration, creating memorials, museums, coming to terms with the politics of collaboration. Now, that's the part one of your question.
Yeah.
Part two is, how does Tardi deal with that? Tardi is an interesting figure because he comes from the far left. He is of that younger generation. And I guess he explores these problems in two ways, or three ways actually. So one way he explores those problems is through a series of historically set crime comics about a detective called Léo Mallet. and one of those is set during the occupation. And while in the foreground we have this crime story, in the background, Tardi does reveal, many of the political nuances and cultural activities of what the occupation meant. So it's called, the crime novel is called 100. It's the title of an address, 120 Rue de la Gare, 120 Railway Street. And so he does do a crime. The initial treatment is this kind of crime comic, where in the foreground there's all the mystery of a crime story, but in the background, an exposition on the history of the occupation. So that's one way he deals with it early in his career. Then I suppose he goes back to the First World War and says, look, I've seen all these movies and stuff about the Second World War, but, my grandfather fought in the First World War, and France, ordinary French people suffered. The casualties of the First World War are huge. And so I guess he has a kind of pacifist, a general pacifist tone that gravitates him back to the First World War. And then finally, I'm looking to my books to my left, and I'm going to get a bit of, it's going to be a moving image and get another book. He then, Jackson, you should never leave the screen empty, should you? It's very bad TV. So he then finally produces a memoir of the experiences of his father, who was a prisoner of war in 1940. And he pulls into attention, this is in his much more recent work, the story of those Germans who were captured in 1940 by the Nazis and held in prison camps. And that's a story that's not been told that much, because they weren't in the resistance, so they weren't the heroes of the resistance, they weren't collaborators, but to some extent the collaborating leader always justified some of his pro-German policies by saying, we've got these prisoners of war, we have to be good. So he picks a personal story, the story of his father, and he picks an aspect of the history of the occupation that is actually hugely important and hasn't had much discussion, and that's what happened to the prisoners of war. So the humiliation of being captured and defeated in 1940, and then their life experiences of being moved into the Third Reich to prison camps. So very long-winded answer, but hopefully people are vaguely interested in listening to it. He's using pictures and images, the comic strip format, and he's looking at the defeat, 1940. He's looking at general stories of pacifism. And then he does do this one crime novel that's early in his career that has the occupation in the backdrop.
And it seems that, all these things that you're mentioning in the backdrop, they're exposing different parts of the wars. So how significant is his addition to the French war narrative, and how much is he exposing to the French people through his medium?
Yeah, lots is the answer. He's very, very influential, really. So again, comic strips in France are one of the best-selling forms of publishing. So we're not really used to it in the UK, but if you go in a French bookshop, you'll see hundreds of these types of albums, all in the style of Asterix and Tintin that we're more used to. But it's been the growth area of French publishing in the last 25 years. So he is absolutely as significant a popular representation of history as any movie or any British TV series. So, we're not quite on the level of Downton Abbey or something like that, but we're not talking about a minor intellectual thing. They're big news. They get reviewed in all the major newspapers. Every major bookshop buys them. And I guess since the late 60s, adults have been reading these kind of comics in France. So he's huge. His influence stretches on to museums. So in the anniversaries of the First World War, his iconography and drawing will have been used in museums and public heritage. He is a phenomenon in France, and it's a big shaping factor. Actually, it's probably more important than school teaching. They're probably more important than university courses.
Well,
It's for everybody, you know. Everybody who likes comics can come to these stories of history that Tardi's making.
I suppose it makes it more accessible than a university level course on the same thing. But how does his approach differ from how other people are approaching the topic?
Yeah, basically, I guess. Well, you've hit the answer already. Partly, the comic strip format gives you a play of words and images, and a readability that even for a very traumatic story about the trenches or a traumatic story about defeat in 1940, that material you can read much quicker. The power of the image and the word, the combination of the two together, the accessibility of the format is a key influence that he has. I guess the other thing that does distinguish him from other people is there are history books of these subjects. Of course, there are great academic historians of the First World War and of the defeat. But really, he's taking that research and moving it into popular culture. And there is no, you know, he's unique in that sense. There are other comic strips, but none of them as significant. And it's his life's work, really.
And it's
So
quite
he's carved out this space of the French European history comic.
and it's quite interesting to see that he's being quite open with telling his family's story, which some people still don't touch upon their family's position or stories within these world wars. So if you don't mind me asking, can you tell us more about? I know you mentioned his father in the prison camps, but can you tell us more about his family's treatments during these mad events?
Yeah, I guess so. Well, mainly I'd recommend your readers to go, viewers to go off and buy the book and read it for
Yeah.
themselves. So, and that would be much better than me paraphrasing or picking a page. I guess you're right. The autobiographical gives it a highly personal level and makes it maybe come to life a bit more. And what it does is it takes the dates and the statistics and the big political events and it makes them feel true. And it equally shows the impact of those events on the individual and on like a family unit. So he's able to, it's interesting, I don't know how many of your, people who are following you and everything, in England, we talk about like social history and history from below, where you get the perspective of ordinary people or of working class or lower middle class or whatever. What he's doing through the autobiographical or the focus of the biographical is it is a kind of social history. It's looking at the experiences of people. It's in the drawings. It's showing the objects, the clothes, the kind of the weather of a prison camp, the winter, the cold, the rain, the mud of the trenches, the equipment. So there's a huge amount of visual authenticity. And then there's the authenticity of the individual's life story. And I guess that's what he's giving. We haven't really, I mean, the nearest we have in English language is the American Holocaust memoir Mouse by Art Spiegelman. That's the comparative, the obvious first comparison that does the same. It's interesting. British war memory of the Second World War isn't really discussed that much here. it looms in some aspects of popular culture, but I guess we've had the film Dunkirk, uh, other films to do with Bletchley Park and that kind of thing. But that there hasn't been a kind of big autobiographical, the story of your grandparents or great grandparents or your viewers' great grandparents or mine. We haven't really had a major. Okay, here's a question for anyone who's actually listening and email Jackson. Is there in England an ordinary life story of the Second World War that has affected popular culture? I don't think there is. It's not my specialism, but I don't think there is. So he provides that. It's something that we haven't got.
Well,
An individual life story.
I definitely think people do want to listen to you, Hugo. So do not worry about that at all.
I
But I think it's very interesting to see that differing relationship between us and the French, given that we were going through similar things at the same time. We were going through, flirts with differing levels of socialism, of course, colonialism, capitalism, and so on. And Tardi represents these in his work.
Yeah, he does.
But what position is he writing from, and why does he feel that it's so important to try and represent these as opposed to just telling a story?
Yeah, I guess apart from some kind of personal testimony to his own family, I guess he feels he's on the side of the underdog and of the working class. And he's a kind of engaged left-wing writer. So he's got his strong desire for historical accuracy and detail, and then his strong desire for the personal certainly in the 1941. He references his older members of First World War victims, as it were. So he's got this personal line, but then underneath it, there is a political line too. And the political line is highly critical of France as a great power, hugely critical of the French state as an imperial state, hugely critical of the military elite in the First World War and the arms manufacturers. Basically, a matrix of left-wing interpretation of the failures of the upper class to protect its citizens, and in fact throwing them into the mass graves of the First World War. So it's a very critical history underneath. He's a pacifist, he's a socialist. It's a very critical history of a history from below. So there are different views on the First World War. There's lots of arguments about it. There are many different views on colonialism as well. But he comes from this very critical tradition.
And we can see these left-wing views of Tardi, and they emerge in other pieces of work. They're not always there about the Second World War or the First World War. And he works on socialist events in French history as well, such as May 1968. So could you tell us about some of these events and how Tardi works on them?
Yeah, a little bit. It's moving out of my areas of focus a bit, but yeah, no, he's a machine of historical representation. I could pile up the books. So there are other ones hidden somewhere in this office. A series of fictional stories set during the Paris Commune of 1870. So 1870, famous revolution, the first attempt of the workers in Paris to run their own city, crushed by the crushed after months. Something that Marx and Lenin looked to as an example of revolution. So he's done books on the Paris Commune, 1870. He's done a commemorative illustrated book with popular songs and a CD of protest songs around the kind of complicated student riots and disputes of the end of the 60s, so-called May 68. And so I guess it's quite interesting, isn't it? Very good question, Jackson. There he's celebrating the struggle of the left. whereas in the war books, he's showing the victims of the right.
So
Great question.
yeah, it seems
So
to
it's
be that
really
he's
about his work again
yeah.
anew. So yeah, basically, he either celebrates the struggles of the left, or the uh, or commemorates and exposes how people are the victims of the right.
It seems to be a a historical biography timeline throughout his work of the left and how it's evolved from being that revolution to right through to the world wars on what's happening and how it's emerging, right to modern day socialism, to protecting people and the working rights, and like you said earlier, history from below. And it's very interesting to know that people are able to depict that in a different way than just the creating an academic textbook.
Yeah, no, very good point too. Uh, yeah, but it is a unique. He is a kind of unique phenomenon in European history, actually, and people should be more interested. He's been translated. You can read quite a lot in English now, and you're spot on, because what he's doing is he's telling life stories, semi-fictional, semi-historical stories that, taken together, form this huge archive of a his vision of the 20th century, which, uh, without repeating the same point, really is a vision of acknowledging the sufferings of the ordinary people and arguing against war and showing the consequences of war, showing the consequences of empire as well, but primarily war, and then contributing to commemorations of revolution. Uh, he also does fun stuff too. I think
Yeah.
the other element is, I mean, some of these things seem, and many of them are very heavy, as it were, and quite political, as we've been saying. But the early series, the kind of horror stories of Paris with monsters and mad scientists and crazed archaeologists, the work that made him famous at the beginning of his career, The Adventures of Adèle Blanc-Sec, they're very satirical, they're very funny, they've got the moments of bleakness, but in the stories of Blanc-Sec, she fights dinosaurs, pterodactyls flying over the Eiffel Tower, crazy monsters coming out of the canals of Paris. There's a sci-fi, huge sci-fi, satirical sci-fi fantasy element to them. And yet in the background, the victims are the ordinary people, and the corrupt are the politicians and the arms manufacturers and the generals. So they're much more fun. I mean, I have to admit, I started this kind of journey of being interested in these things seriously, I suppose, about 20 years ago. And that was when I discovered Adèle Blanc-Sec and bought all the books, and was like, they were like the coolest thing I'd ever read, and just wanted to read them and read them. And then I've done many other things in between. As you know, I dot around in my research and interests. And then this autumn, being asked to do a talk about Tardi, or offering to do one in America online, I suddenly came back to look at it all again and tried to summarize, what he might mean.
No.
I need to do, this is not the product of 6 years of research. It's an on-off fascination with Tardi.
Oh,
And in the end, I thought, who do I want to talk about to these American students? Somebody else is doing Tintin. I can't do Tintin. Well, who else am I interested in? Who do I actually admire? And I guess I do think Tardi's very interesting. I hadn't read his production. He produces these, one or two of these nearly every 2 or 3 years, until like re-dipping in. I hadn't read the stories of the defeat, the 1941, because I'd been doing other stuff.
well, like most historians, we all have a variety of different interests. We all dot in and out of things. So I wouldn't blame you at all for dipping in and out of different interests. Now, we here in Britain, we have a national epic, a national story, which we all kind of conform to. Probably the best example is H.E. Marshall's Our Island Story, which tends to be the given version of events, regardless of how accurate those events are. You know, the French do have their own national narrative and their own epics and Charlemagne and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But how
And there,
does Tardi differ from that national epic?
yeah, good question. Again, sorry to sound
No,
annoying when
nice.
I answer your questions, but they are good, and it gives me some minutes to think about how I might answer. So that's a difficult question. He sits within it. He sits within uh, a. I suppose the first part is, what is the French national story? And the truth is, there are many different versions depending on the time and the political emphasis. But I suppose he fits within a story of celebrating revolution, the republic, liberty, fraternity, equality. He sits within a story of wanting to improve France. So the revolution is a story of improvement, so away from monarchy to democracy. Now we know there's huge problems, and we have empires and collaboration and many faults in between, but the original, the spirit of the republic is to improve. And so we have liberty, the freedom of speech. We have equality, which could be economic equality or equality of rights. And fraternity, again, friendship could be the story of more social improvement. So he actually sits within a traditional French national story of the left. And I guess as an artist, the liberty of expression is important for him. The secular nature of that national story as well. So it's that we, the people, not some preordained monarch in a theological world system, but the ordinary people live by liberty, fraternity, and equality, and that it's for the people to decide that version of democracy. Now, I'm sounding very wistful and romantic about French republicanism. For anybody listening, I know there are many problems with it all. I know it can be critiqued, but to answer Jackson's smart question, he sits within that socialist tradition of republican improvement.
It's
But
it's
by celebrating revolution and criticizing counter-revolution.
it's quite interesting to see that someone who does criticize the regime and has criticized France's past still sits within that national narrative, still sits
Yeah,
within that idea of what France is. And it's very, like, in most places, someone who will sit back and criticize sits outside of that national narrative. And
yeah.
the French embrace of his narrative and his storyline is very interesting to see, because that doesn't necessarily happen everywhere.
No, it doesn't. And he's unique. And in that sense, the story of the Republic is a kind of unique national history. It's the left exists in France. It's not my field of research really at all, but the strong left tradition that's loyal to that idea of making the Republic a better place all the time is very strong. Now it faces the problems that we're familiar with the challenges around freedom of speech and religion and post-colonialism. So it's certainly not without its problems, but he does sit broadly within that field.
Now,
I guess his contribution is a revelation of the horrors of the First World War. That's his prime revelation to that narrative, that the Republic went wrong, that the First World War was a disaster, that ordinary people suffered, ordinary Germans, ordinary Brits, Australians. Towards the end of one of the stories, We see, you know, the colonial troops of the British and French suffering, the Americans who've been pulled into the war. Basically, he contributes the emphasis of this cataclysm of the First World War for ordinary people. And, you know, that's under the Third Republic. And I guess the imperial rivalries that contribute to the outbreak of the war, that's his kind of historiographic point. He cut, like we started with at the very beginning, he does comment on Vichy, and he does comment on the fall of France, and he's, you know, palpably aware of the horrors of the occupation. But in terms of his, you know, this is just my opinion, in terms of his long-term impact, the pulling of the troubles of the First World War to our attention is a primary contribution of Tardi. I mean, the story of the ordinary soldiers in 1940 is very important too, because in many ways it could be forgotten without this kind of, you know, popular representation.
And it's very
So yeah,
interesting.
you can see I do like it. I find it
Yeah.
very interesting.
No,
And you're right. You're right to say he's unique. We don't have there is no sustain. You know, again, send emails to Jackson, not me. Is there a one British cultural figure of any political persuasion who systematically over their whole career has developed a narrative of British 20th century history? I don't know. I'm not an English expert. Send, you know, English, not other, the English contemporary novel of the 20th century. Ian McEwan, maybe people might mention. Martin Amis, people might mention in terms of fiction, but they're not quite, you know, there's not the sustained modern historical novelist or graphic novelist at all. And then if you look at film and television, we have famous series, mini-series, episodes, things come and go, but they're made by different teams of people. He's like he draws and writes. He collaborates with researchers, but he's like a single artistic phenomenon in that sense.
Well, I'm very happy to be inundated with emails regarding this, and I will pass anything on to Hugo.
Tell us who in British popular culture has written a sustained historical narrative of the 20th century.
And I find it quite interesting his internationalization of that cultural memory. You know, when we the British look at, you know, world wars, we look at it from our perspective. We don't necessarily look at it from, you know, an empire sense or perspective, a Commonwealth perspective. We don't look at it from a European perspective. And same with the Americans. The Americans tend to look at things from their own soldiers' perspective within these things. So it's very interesting to see that he's, you know, like you've just said, picking up how it's affected the Germans, the Australians, the British, and so on.
Yeah, that comes from his socialism, in there's this internationalism behind it, and his sense that the ordinary people suffered the same on every side. So I guess you have that a little bit in, you know, there's the famous myths of, you know, British soldiers playing football with German soldiers during the Christmas truce of the First World War. That's a kind of hint of that. But you're right, he strongly advocates a kind of internationalism that shows that the ordinary soldiers on every side have suffered. And that, of course, includes colonial troops.
And I think it's quite, it's probably forward thinking from when he wrote it, that nowadays we tend to, now we're getting these opening up of colonial history and international narratives. And from where I'm sitting and from what you've taught me, that you know, Jacques Tardi was and probably still is ahead of his time in terms of these narratives.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the First World War book to make sure I'm not making it up, because that wouldn't be very sensible for a historian, really. So he certainly does include these references out. Yeah, Here we go. We have a pauvre Sikh, so a Sikh soldier in the British colonial army. And this is the First World War book that he first publishes in 1993. So he's, academic historians in Britain, I just more or less finished my history degree in 1993. And, we were questioning these things then as well. But I guess in British society more generally, it's more recent. The debates have become more foregrounded much more recently. So yes, he is ahead of his time.
That really
And
is. Sorry, Hugo.
what I was going to say is equally he's unique in terms of using drawings in comics.
And then
that's just looking at the images, they're so brutal and so real. And you can read the books in an hour or two, or you can look at the pictures and meditate on them for as long as you like, because they're very powerful.
And then in terms of Jacques Tardi, like we've said, he's a cartoonist, he's an artist, and there's been a lot of artists who have depicted certain people in different ways. I can't quite remember his name off the top of my head, and I think he used to depict certain soldiers as pairs within his cartoon. So does Tardi do any of this?
No, he's more realistic. Basically, he's super realistic. He draws. The drawing style is slightly cartoony, but always with a strong emotional realism to it. So, interesting one for history teachers out there, maybe wanting to get students interested in a topic. His drawings are brutally, in It Was the War of the Trenches, the drawings are brutally realistic, but have a slightly cartoony style. So he kind of fulfills the needs of a comic by being not photographs, not paintings, but there is a kind of cartoony realism to them. He, in the story of his father, he includes a little boy who is logically him, and there's a kind of underlying conversation from the past to the future. So that's a little bit of a kind of artistic technique where we have, I don't know how we could do it. We could draw you and me walking around, a industrial factory, talking to a worker, going, what was it like in the factory? So he does a bit of time, playing with time, by having a perspective of the present a little bit encoded into the past, by drawing a kind of commentator.
And then sticking with that idea of the present, how he's a very popular figure. They, like you said, they see him as like a superstar in France, but that's the people. How does the establishment view Tardi?
I think they celebrate him too, actually. Maybe because of this would be subject to hours of research that I've not done. So, very keen to hear views on this again, to Jackson or me, from anybody interested listening. There are definitely experts on Tardi, far more specialists than I am out there. So, send us a message if you ever come across it. But the impression that I get, and that's just from, looking from some interest, is, he's celebrated, he's honoured, he's a national figure in a way, because of that situating within the Republican story. And then I guess the general public's attitude to the First World War is broadly shared with his. And the idea of the war as a terrible catastrophe is probably the kind of dominant view. And so again, people must check, but I'm pretty sure that I've seen use of his images in posters for museums. he's mainstream. You know, it's interesting. You picked up on it again. An interesting point for people not living in France is that on the one hand he's got this kind of line of interpretation, and it all feels kind of new and avant-garde, but actually he's pretty celebrated, and you know, every mainstream bookshop, posters in the bookshop windows, definitely, you know, influence on First World War museums, the 100th anniversary. You know, he himself is a national treasure in a way. He on the one hand, he's clearly of the left, but I guess there's a broad consensus around the First World War as a catastrophe.
Okay. And then, you know, if our listeners want to go away and learn more about Tardi and French history, or just read some work that Tardi has done, which ones would you recommend?
Okay, so definitely any of the Adèle Blanc-Sec fantasy fiction books that basically trace the misadventures of Adèle Blanc-Sec, a lady heroine living in Paris on the eve of the First World War. And they're entertaining and poignant and funny and brilliantly drawn and colourful and clever. And I'm afraid I haven't read them for an awful long time. When I read them, they made me want to study comics again. So I think they're great. Then It Was the War of the Trenches is the definitive First World War account. So I would go with those. And then the memoir of his father is a very personal account for people interested in military history, and people who probably would be very interested in the Second World War and want to know more about the prisoners of war. The crime ones are great too. So the crime novel adaptations of Léo Mallet are a kind of detective series set in and around 40s, 50s France. They're quite bleak, but they're for people who love Paris. Paris is the other thing I've not talked about. The city of Paris is central in a lot of his work, and the Léo Mallet adaptations, the crime novels, are all set in different parts of Paris, and so you know you can read them and then think you're in Paris.
That's pretty.
He loves drawing Paris, so they're good for anybody who likes Paris and French history.
That's a good lockdown read, just to get a little bit of an escape. So,
if you can't go to Paris, read a Jacques Tardi graphic novel.
And then our final fun question, as we do for all our guests here on the History of Jackson podcast: what 3 graphic novels or cartoons or comics, regardless if they're Tardi or not, are your favourites?
Okay, so difficult. So let me think about this. Well, I suppose there are no favourites as such, but the three for people to read to have different perspectives on the world are we definitely have Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is from America and is the famous memoir of the Holocaust and Holocaust surviving and not surviving. So definitely Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Marianne Satrapi's Persepolis, on her story of migration to Europe from troubled Middle East. And then, yeah, let's go with the complete works of Jacques Tardi, because there are so many, I'm not going to pick one.
Well, it's quite...
We'll go with the complete works of Jacques Tardi, which is a lot. Even I haven't read all of them, because there are a lot.
That's quite a broad selection, but having read Mouse myself, you know, I think that is an absolutely phenomenal piece of work, and I would recommend to absolutely anyone who can get their hands on that to go and have a read of it, because it is just truly fascinating, truly amazing. So thank you very much, Hugo.
No, thank you, Jackson. It's another good example of how a personal story can be told through a comic strip format that then will give you, as history buffs and history fans or history students, it'll just give you a different, all of these things give you a slightly different twist. and will help you think again about the types of history you're interested in. So, on that
Oh,
point, I will thank you, Jackson. So, thank you so much for asking me. And actually, once again, many congratulations on your success
oh, thank you
in
very much.
being brave and innovative and creating a YouTube channel. It's very clever.
And if anyone wants to keep up to date with you online, where can they find you?
Well, they cannot find me anywhere, to be honest,
Okay.
Jackson. The short answer to that question. They can find, if they Google me on Amazon or on JSTOR or in their university library. Basically, I let my books and writings and public activities sell themselves. Very old-fashioned. I have occasional promotion from the university marketing department, but overall, I let my publishers promote me, and my books are in most university libraries. So that's where people can find me. Hugo Frey, any university library catalogue.
And your
That's
complete catalog work is available on your university profile as well, if I'm correct.
it is. It's a little bit out of date. There's been more stuff since then. Basically, my works on graphic novels are with Cambridge University Press, and you'll see those on their website and on Amazon. And then books on French cinema, all on. I don't know if I'm supposed to promote Amazon or not, having talked about Jacques Tardi in the left, but I just love buying books, so I'm afraid my own leftist credentials just collapse at the possibility of the quickest way of buying a book. So yeah, basically in all good bookshops and
Awesome.
university library catalogues and JSTOR occasionally.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Hugo. And
No,
thank
it's
you
a
very
pleasure,
much for
Jack.
coming on the podcast.
No, thank you. It's good fun. It was very good fun.